Let's continue on with part 2 of our overview of parallel functional programming with Java and Android. Here we're going to talk about the assignments and the assessments of the assignments, which may be a little different from other classes you've done in computer science, unless you've taken one of my classes before, because we do the same thing every class. So the programming assignments are all going to be written in so-called modern Java. We'll talk more about what that is shortly, using Android Studio. You can use any IDE that you want, but your final submission, the one that you submit for grading, must build and run correctly with the latest Android Studio. We'll talk about what that means in a second, and with Android 13, which is API level 33. They're probably going to release API of 34 here in a couple months, but we didn't want to mess around with that, so we'll stick with 33. The Java runtime environment comes pre-installed with Android, which is nice. It used to be complicated. You used to have to go out and explicitly download things. You don't have to do that anymore. And you need to make sure that you use Android Studio, which you can get from this link. It has a whole bunch of cool features, very few of which we will actually use, because we're not actually building apps. We've got an app that comes pre-designed where you fill in some pieces that focus on the parallel programming aspects. And as you'll see, there's an emulator that you're going to have that will probably be very useful for testing your programs. There'll be other ways to test things as well. There's also a debugger. So make sure you're at least passingly familiar with using Android Studio. As I said before, please use the Tiramisu version, which is API level 33. And all the source code and assignment examples are available on my GitHub account. And so if you go to this link, you'll get that. I also posted on Piazza right before class the link to, or a description of how to get the first programming assignment. You'll need to know some Git, which we'll talk about here in just a minute. You need to learn how to use Git, and we'll talk about how to set up Git here in a minute. And you'll be using Gitlab. The nice thing about Gitlab is by default, all projects are private, which is different from GitHub, where all projects are public. And of course, you want your projects to be private so that only me and the graders/TAs can look at them. You don't want other people to be able to see them, except yourself. You will need to update your repository occasionally, and you will specifically need to do it for assignment 1. I put assignment 1 out for various reasons, mostly having to do with ChatGPT. We haven't finished off the tests for assignment 1 yet, which should come out in a few days. So I wanted you to get a head start so you can get the specification, the skeletons, the app that runs things, which you can use as a surrogate for some testing. If you watch the video that describes this, it'll explain how that works. The assignments are going to give you a whole bunch of experience with modern Java and Android parallel programming. In particular, we're going to be implementing an image crawler app on Android. It's not going to use Spring this semester. It's just going to use Android. And this will demonstrate a whole bunch of cool things with modern Java. So you'll need to use lambda expressions, method references, and functional interfaces, which you can learn by watching my playlist that covers all those topics if you don't have familiarity with them. And then we're going to focus on the Java fork join pool. That's assignment number 1. Then Java sequential and parallel streams. That'll be assignment number 2. Java completable futures, which will be assignment number 3. And then Java reactive streams, which will be assignment number 4. We might modify this a tad based on various factors that occur, but I'm pretty convinced that's what we're going to do this semester. The assignments are going to be reviewed by the course staff. That means me. And this is the way it's going to work. First of all, there's a 2-phase process for submitting assignments. The first phase is where you submit your initial submission. That's what we call it, the initial submission. And you absolutely have to submit it on time. Very, very, very important. If you don't submit it on time, I don't review it. Bad news. So make sure you submit things on time. And this is all described in the course fact. Now, your initial submission doesn't have to be perfect, which is why I review it, but it does need to compile, and it needs to be largely complete. You need to have made a good faith effort at trying to do it. If you just throw a bunch of spaghetti on your screen and it doesn't make any sense, I'm not going to review it. Do not pass go. Do not collect $200. Not good. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to submit your initial submission. I will review it. I will provide you with individualized feedback. I will also create a video that walks through what I like to call the frequently made mistakes. Sometimes they're not really mistakes. They're just things that could be improved. And then I post that video, and then you can watch that and learn how to improve the stuff that I marked as being requiring remediation. And then you'll get a short time. This is what depends on how well people do. If people are struggling, then I give a little bit longer time to revise things. If people do a pretty good job, I'll give a very short time, like a couple of days. It'll never be like the next day. But after you get the reviews back, you get a chance to revise your program. Then you resubmit it. We'll talk about how you do that process. All of that's through Git and Gitlab. And then the TA and grader will review it, and then you'll get a final grade. So the good news here is if you're diligent, you submit things on time, you're willing to take constructive criticism to improve your stuff, you should do very well. If, however, you don't submit things on time, or you don't pay any attention to the deadlines, or you don't pay any attention to the reviewer comments, you will not do very well. And every year, most people do very well, and there are a few people who just for whatever reason decide not to do anything, and then they usually fail, which is never pleasant. So try not to be those people. Now, you've got to attend class. So you need to be in class for all kinds of reasons. This is the way that I ensure that people pay attention. And so if you don't attend class, we will not review your assignments. Work must be your own. Now, this is where things get really fun. So this applies for quizzes and programming assignments. And when you use large language model tools, you are always responsible for the output of them. There's a course policy that's come out, which I think I was in my first set of slides had the link to the course policy, or sorry, the Vanderbilt-wide policy for large language models. And the language model policy is basically, it's up to the instructor to decide what to do. Some people have decided we are going to ban the use of these tools. I personally think that's a losing proposition for a whole bunch of reasons, some of which having to do with the fact that the future of our field for sure is working hand in hand with these things. And secondly, there's human nature. So I think it's very hard to fight against human nature and the way the world's going. So our policy is you can use these things, but you are responsible for the results. So if ChatGPT gives you ridiculous results and you submit that and your program doesn't work, it's not ChatGPT's fault. You can't come and say, ChatGPT led me down the primrose path and it screwed me over and I deserve to get points back because it was the large language model that did it. No, you are responsible for whatever it produces that you leverage. So that's kind of the policy. This is actually the policy that the university has put out. So you should probably take a look at that. Again, basic rule, which is not as important here, but it probably is very important for a lot of your other classes. Some people have decided they will not pay attention to this. They want to pretend like it doesn't exist. You can't use it at all. I think, again, that's a losing proposition. So we'll use it as directed. The bulk of your grade will be based on the results of automated unit tests. Now, this is something that we may have to refine a little bit for reasons having to do with ChatGPT and the other large language models. But at the very least, to start out with, you will have an opportunity to run tests. You will pretty much always know at any given point how well you're going to do or not do by looking at the output from your tests. Now, we may also review things for other design features and commenting and so on, but the tests are super important, and that's really easy to figure out how you're doing. My video shows you how to run the tests. The first video, the first set of assignments, the first assignment doesn't have the full unit test yet, but we will release those shortly. It's also important, remember this is covered in this item in the FAQ. When the second and subsequent assignments come out, you have to continue to have your previous assignments work, otherwise you lose points. Now, why is that? Two reasons. Number one, when we take a look at the kinds of mistakes people make, we often come up with better ways to write tests to catch the problems. So between releases of the assignments, we often improve the unit tests. So therefore, just because something passed the unit test in the first assignment doesn't mean your code was correct, because testing never shows the absence of bugs, only the presence of bugs. Therefore, we continue to add tests that will catch more bugs. So you have to make sure you go back and fix things. And that's also a very important philosophy about working with software if you decide to go in that direction at some point in your life. In real life, people maintain versions over time. So just because you had version 1.0 and you released version 2.0 doesn't mean you have to just forget all your customers who are stuck with version 1.0 and not fix their bugs too. So it's kind of giving you some practice of real life experiences. The relative weighting of the courses will be 45% for the quizzes, 40% for the programming projects, 10% for the final exam, if we have one, and then 5% for participation. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. We may change this weighting a bit depending on factors. For example, if you don't have a final exam, then we'll make the quizzes 50% and the programming projects 45%. Participation. This includes several things. Coming to class. Being involved in class. Don't just sit there all the time as a bump on a log. Being involved, asking questions. And perhaps my most important one, following directions. The directions here are usually pretty simple. It's mostly about make sure you don't miss deadlines, and also do other things. We'll talk about some other things, like please try not to send me email directly, but post it on Piazza. You can post it privately, of course. And that means most likely I won't miss it because I get a lot of email. And so I need to make sure I separate those things, and putting them on Piazza will solve a lot of the problems. This also affects other aspects of your quiz and assignment grades, as we've talked about, and is summarized in detail on the course website. If you really just don't come to class and don't participate, you may have a hard time getting an A, even if you do well on the quizzes and relatively well on the quizzes and the programming assignments. So make sure you show up and be involved. So that's the end of part 2 of the overview.